Today, we're talking about a situation that almost no one explains calmly or honestly. What a woman feels when you simply disappear. Not what she posts online, not what friends assume. What happens internally, emotionally, and psychologically when your presence is suddenly gone. Welcome back to the channel. If this topic makes you uncomfortable already, that's a good sign. It means you're paying attention. As a therapist, I've sat across from many people navigating the silence left behind when someone they were attached to vanished without explanation. Because of confidentiality, I'll never name anyone or give details that expose them. But patterns repeat, emotions repeat, human responses repeat, and that's where experience becomes valuable. This video isn't about punishment, revenge, or playing games. It's also not about blaming women or glorifying emotional withdrawal. It's about understanding impact. And yes, that understanding can feel controversial because it challenges the popular belief that disappearing automatically means you never mattered. That belief sounds comforting, but it's rarely true. When a man disappears, no texts, no arguments, no closure. It interrupts a psychological loop. The mind doesn't process absence the same way it processes rejection. Rejection has an ending. Silence doesn't. Silence keeps the door mentally open, even when the relationship appears closed on the surface. I've watched confident, emotionally intelligent women struggle with this more than they expected. Not because they were weak, but because the human brain is wired to seek resolution. When it doesn't get it, it fills in the gaps on its own, sometimes accurately, often not. What makes this topic uncomfortable is that disappearance can trigger reflection faster than explanation ever could. It removes the familiar dynamic. It removes reassurance, friction, and validation, all at once. And that sudden removal creates a shift that many people underestimate. Throughout this video, I'm not speaking as a coach trying to hype you up. I'm speaking as someone who's listened quietly to the aftermath, the confusion, the self-questing, the emotional recalibration that follows silence. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just human. In the next sections, we'll walk through 7 emotional experiences that often surface when you disappear. Some will surprise you, some may challenge what you think you already know, and some may force you to rethink the power of absence altogether. 1. Confusion before clarity. Confusion before clarity. Confusion is usually the first emotional response, and it rarely looks dramatic on the outside. From a therapist's perspective, this stage is quiet, internal, and often misunderstood. When you disappear without explanation, the mind doesn't immediately jump to conclusions. Instead, it pauses. It tries to make sense of the absence using logic, memory, and emotional patterns that once felt stable. I've seen this many times in my work. A woman will sit across from me and say something like, "I'm not even angry, I'm just confused." That confusion isn't weakness. It's the brain trying to regain balance after something familiar suddenly stopped behaving the way it always did. Human connection creates rhythm. Messages, calls, presence, even small interactions form predictability. When that rhythm ends abruptly, the nervous system notices before the emotions fully catch up. At this stage, clarity hasn't arrived yet. There's no final story to hold on to. Was it something she said? Something she didn't say? Was it intentional, temporary, or accidental? The mind searches for missing information because uncertainty feels more threatening than bad news. Silence doesn't give answers, so the brain fills the space with possibilities. What makes this phase particularly powerful is that it delays emotional resolution. When someone is rejected clearly, the pain is sharp but defined. When someone disappears, the pain is vague, and vague pain lingers. Confusion keeps emotional doors open longer than certainty ever would, not because she wants them open, but because the mind hasn't been told to close them. In therapy sessions, this confusion often shows up as restlessness, difficulty focusing, rereading old conversations, remembering moments that didn't seem important at the time. The brain is scanning the past, looking for a clue that explains the present. This isn't obsession, it's pattern recognition under stress. What's interesting is that during this phase, emotions are often suspended. She may still function normally, still laugh, still go about her day, but internally, there's a quiet hum of unresolved thought. Not panic yet, not clarity either, just a mental pause where the absence hasn't fully registered as permanent. This is also the moment where assumptions haven't hardened. She hasn't yet decided what your disappearance means about her, about you, or about the connection. That's why confusion is such a fragile state. It's emotionally neutral, but psychologically active. From experience, I can say this stage doesn't last forever. The mind eventually demands clarity, but before it arrives, confusion does something important. It forces reflection, not because she wants to analyze, but because the silence leaves her no choice. 2. The sudden, the sudden loss of emotional control, loss of emotional control. This stage is where many men misunderstand what's actually happening. From the outside, it may look like nothing has changed. She might still go to work post-normally, even seem calm, but internally something important has shifted. When you disappear, emotional control often weakens before emotions themselves become visible. As a therapist, I've learned that emotional control isn't about strength. It's about predictability. When a connection feels stable, the mind regulates itself easily. Expectations are clear. Emotional responses stay proportionate. But when that stability vanishes without warning, regulation becomes harder, even for people who are usually grounded. I've heard women say, "I don't like that I'm thinking about this so much. I feel out of control." That loss of control doesn't mean obsession. It means the emotional system lost a reference point. Your presence, communication, or consistency had become part of how her emotional world stayed organized. When it disappeared, the system had to recalibrate in real time. This is important for men to understand. Emotional control isn't lost because you were perfect or irreplaceable. It's lost because sudden absence disrupts expectation. The brain prepares for continuation, not disappearance. When continuation doesn't happen, emotional responses become harder to predict and manage. During this phase, emotions may come in waves rather than steady feelings. Calm one moment, unsettled the next. Not because she's unstable, but because the emotional environment changed without warning. Silence removes feedback, and without feedback, the mind struggles to regulate intensity. In sessions, this often shows up as frustration directed inward. She may feel annoyed with herself for caring, for wondering, for feeling affected. That internal conflict between I should be fine and I don't feel fine creates emotional tension. And tension feels like loss of control. Men often assume control is lost because a woman is emotionally dependent. That assumption is wrong and oversimplified. Control is lost because the emotional contract changed without notice. Any human being, regardless of gender, reacts to sudden withdrawal of connection with instability before balance returns. What disappearance does, unintentionally or not, is remove emotional grounding. When someone is present, even inconsistently, the mind adjusts around that. When they vanish, there's nothing to adjust to yet. Emotional regulation needs something to regulate against. This phase educates men in a powerful way. Silence is not neutral. It's an emotional stimulus. It forces the other person's nervous system to work harder to regain balance. That doesn't make sense wrong or manipulative by default, but it does mean it has psychological weight. Eventually, emotional control returns. But before it does, the absence teaches a lesson most men never hear. Presence stabilizes emotions, and its removal destabilizes them, whether you intended that effect or not. 3. Self-questioning. That wasn't there. Before self-questioning, that wasn't there before. This is the point where the experience becomes deeply personal, not loud, not dramatic, but quietly unsettling. When you disappear, self-questioning often enters the picture, not because she suddenly lacks confidence, but because silence redirects attention inward. From a therapeutic perspective, this is one of the most misunderstood reactions. Many men assume that if a woman begins questioning herself, it means she was insecure all along. That's rarely true. What actually happens is that unanswered silence removes external reference points, and when there's no external explanation, the mind turns inward to find one. I've listened to women describe this stage with a surprising amount of honesty. They don't start by criticizing you. They start by reviewing themselves. Did I misread things? Was I too open? Did I miss a signal? These questions don't come from self-blame. They come from the brain's need to restore coherence. When something ends without explanation, the mind assumes there must be a reason. And when no reason is given, the most available place to search is the self. This isn't weakness. It's how humans make sense of relational uncertainty. What makes this stage engaging and often uncomfortable is that it creates contrast. Before the disappearance, many women feel emotionally steady. After they notice thoughts they didn't have before, not because something was wrong earlier, but because something is missing now. In therapy, this phase often surprises the person experiencing it. They'll say, "I don't usually think like this." That statement matters. It tells us the self-questing isn't a personality trait. It's a response, a temporary mental adjustment to unresolved absence. The questions aren't always negative. Sometimes they're reflective. Sometimes they're neutral. But they all serve the same function, trying to locate where certainty broke down. The mind wants to know whether the loss came from outside or inside. This is also where memory becomes selective. Moments that once felt ordinary gain new weight. Conversations are replayed with new interpretation, not because she's stuck in the past, but because the present offers no explanation. For men, this is a critical insight. Disappearing doesn't just remove you from her life, it removes context. And when context disappears, the mind reconstructs it using available material. Often that material is self-reflection. What's important to understand is that this stage doesn't last forever. Self-questioning eventually leads somewhere either toward clarity, detachment, or emotional recalibration. But before it resolves, it does something powerful. It forces a reassessment of emotional investment, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, internal way that most people never talk about. This is why disappearance has impact beyond presence. It doesn't just end interaction, it redirects attention inward. And once that process begins, it changes how the connection is remembered, understood, and eventually placed in the past. 4. Replaying moments to find meaning. Moments to find meaning. When the disappearance happens within the context of an ongoing or emotionally established relationship, this stage becomes especially intense. In relationships, meaning isn't built on one moment. It's built on patterns, shared routines, emotional signals, future plans, unspoken understandings. So when one person suddenly vanishes, the mind doesn't just notice the absence, it begins retracing the entire relationship, looking for where the meaning shifted. As a therapist, I've seen this often with people who believed the relationship was stable, not perfect, but real. They'll say things like, "We were talking about next week," or "Nothing felt off the last time we spoke." That's where the replaying begins, not out of obsession, but out of disbelief. The brain struggles to reconcile continuity with sudden absence. In a relationship, moments are stored differently. Small interactions carry emotional weight because they're part of a larger story. A laugh, a disagreement, a moment of closeness. These aren't isolated events, they're chapters. When you disappear, the mind goes back through those chapters trying to find the page where the story quietly changed direction. This replaying often focuses on subtle shifts, tone changes, timing of responses. A sentence that felt slightly different in hindsight, not because those moments were clearly problematic, but because the mind is searching for meaning that wasn't provided at the end. Silence forces the mind to become its own narrator. What's important for men to understand here is that in relationships, replaying isn't about clinging, it's about coherence. The emotional brain wants the story to make sense. And when a relationship ends without explanation, the story feels unfinished. I've watched people in committed relationships struggle with this more than those in casual connections because the deeper the investment, the more material there is to review. Shared experiences create emotional data, And when the ending doesn't match the buildup, the mind revisits the evidence. This stage can feel emotionally heavy because memory becomes active rather than passive. Moments that once felt complete now feel unresolved, not because they were false, but because they didn't lead where they were expected to lead. What's rarely talked about is that this replaying isn't permanent. Eventually, the mind reaches a limit. It realizes that no amount of reviewing will produce new information. But before that realization settles in, the process itself reshapes how the relationship is remembered. The absence doesn't erase the relationship, it reframes it. Meaning is no longer drawn from shared presence, but from reflection. And that shift from living the relationship to analyzing it is one of the quiet emotional consequences of disappearing when someone believed they were still building something with you. The shift from certainty to uncertainty 5. The shift from certainty to uncertainty. In an active relationship, certainty is often invisible because it feels normal. It lives in routines, expectations, and the quiet assumption that tomorrow will look somewhat like today. When you disappear from that kind of connection, the shift from certainty to uncertainty isn't loud, but it's deeply destabilizing. From a therapeutic point of view, this is one of the most emotionally disorienting transitions a person can experience in a relationship. I've sat with people who weren't questioning love, loyalty, or commitment before the silence. They were simply living inside the relationship, and then without warning, the ground beneath that certainty moved. In relationships, certainty doesn't mean everything is perfect. It means the emotional framework is predictable. You know where you stand. You know how conflict is handled. You know communication will resume even after tension. Disappearance disrupts that framework instantly. The mind no longer knows what to expect, and uncertainty takes its place. What's striking is how quickly this shift happens. One day, plans exist, emotional roles exist, assumptions feel safe. The next, everything becomes conditional. Maybe it was never as stable as I thought. Maybe I misunderstood the connection. These thoughts aren't dramatic, they're adaptive. The mind is adjusting to a new emotional reality. In therapy, people often describe this stage as unsettling rather than painful. Pain comes later, uncertainty comes first. It creates a sense of emotional floating where there's no clear direction forward or backward. The relationship hasn't officially ended, but it no longer feels present either. For someone in a relationship, this uncertainty can affect more than emotions. It impacts decision and focus and trust in their own judgment. If something that felt solid could disappear without explanation, what else might be unstable? That question quietly reshapes perception. Men often underestimate how powerful certainty is in relationships. It's not about control or dependence. It's about psychological safety. Certainty allows people to relax emotionally. When it's removed suddenly, the nervous system shifts into alert mode even in the absence of overt conflict. This stage is where many people begin emotionally preparing for loss, not because they've accepted it, but because uncertainty demands readiness. The mind starts loosening attachment not out of choice, but out of self-protection. What disappearance does here is redefine the relationship retroactively. Certainty becomes something that existed in the past, not the present. And once that happens, the emotional bond begins to change shape. Eventually, certainty is replaced by a new form of understanding. But before that happens, this stage leaves a mark. It teaches a quiet lesson about how fragile emotional assumptions can be and how powerful silence is in transforming a relationship from something lived into something questioned. 6. Emotional silence becoming louder than words. This is the stage where silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling heavy, not because anything new happened, but because nothing did. From a therapeutic lens, this is one of the most powerful shifts that occurs after disappearance. Silence stops being the absence of communication and becomes a message of its own. I've heard people say, "I wish he would just say something even if it's not what I want to hear." That sentence captures this phase perfectly. Words, even difficult ones, give the mind something to work with. Silence doesn't. Silence forces interpretation. And Interpretation is rarely neutral. When someone disappears, the emotional system doesn't shut down. It amplifies. Every unanswered question grows louder. Every quiet moment feels more noticeable. The absence begins to occupy mental space in a way words never did. That's why silence can feel more intense than conflict. What makes this stage engaging is that nothing is outwardly happening, yet internally a lot is unfolding. Emotional silence removes reassurance, feedback, and emotional cues all at once. Without those cues, the mind becomes hyper-aware. It listens closely to what isn't being said. In therapy, this phase often reveals itself through language like "the quiet is what bothers me." Not anger, not sadness. The quiet. Because silence doesn't allow emotional completion. It leaves things open-ended, and open-ended emotions tend to echo. Men often assume that silence cools emotions. In reality, unresolved silence concentrates them, not into drama, but into awareness. The absence becomes noticeable in everyday moments, during routine activities, quiet evenings, or moments that once involved shared communication. What's important to understand is that emotional silence isn't passive. It actively reshapes meaning. Without words, the mind assigns its own explanations. Sometimes those explanations are kind, sometimes they're critical, but they all carry weight because they fill the void left by disappearance. This is also where emotional distance starts to form, not because she wants distance, but because silence forces emotional self-reliance. When communication stops, the emotional system adapts by turning inward. That adaptation is subtle, but it's lasting. From experience, I can say this is often the turning point. Silence either pushes someone toward detachment or deeper reflection, but it never leaves things unchanged. Emotional silence presses on unresolved feelings until something shifts. What disappearance teaches here is something rarely acknowledged. Words don't always carry the most impact. Sometimes it's the lack of them that reshapes emotional reality. Eventually, the silence loses its intensity, but before it does, it speaks volumes, not through sound, but through absence. And once someone experiences how loud emotional silence can be, they never quite hear absence the same way again. Awareness of what your absence changed. 7. Awareness of what your absence changed. This final stage is quieter, but it's also the most transformative. By the time someone reaches this point, the initial confusion has softened. The emotional waves have settled, and something new takes shape. Awareness. Not about you specifically, but about what your absence revealed and altered. From a therapist perspective, this is where insight replaces reaction. I've watched people arrive here slowly, often without realizing it at first. They stop, asking, "Why did he disappear?" and start noticing something is different in me now. That shift matters. Absence has a way of highlighting what presence once provided. Not in a romanticized way, but in a practical one. Emotional availability, consistency, reassurance, or even tension. Whatever your role was, its removal creates contrast, and contrast brings clarity. In sessions, this often shows up as realization rather than emotion. Someone might say, "I didn't realize how much I adjusted around him," or "I didn't notice how much energy that connection took." These aren't accusations, they're observations. Awareness isn't about blame, it's about recognition. What's powerful about this stage is that it's no longer centered on loss, it's centered on recalibration. She begins to see how the relationship fit into her life, not just how it ended. Your absence becomes information, not injury. This is also where emotional power subtly shifts, not in a dramatic way, but in a grounded one. The connection is no longer defined by presence or silence, but by understanding. What once felt confusing now feels instructive. Men often don't realize that disappearance can accelerate this awareness. When someone stays but disengages slowly, clarity takes longer. When someone disappears, the contrast is sharper, and sharp contrast brings faster insight. This awareness can take many forms. It might highlight unmet needs. It might reveal emotional patterns. It might clarify boundaries that were previously blurred. Whatever it uncovers, it changes how future connections are approached. From experience, I can say this is where emotional independence strengthens, not because she hardens, but because she integrates the experience. The absence no longer feels personal, it feels educational. Importantly, this stage isn't about closure given by another person. It's self-generated, and self-generated clarity tends to last longer. Your disappearance doesn't define her, but it does influence how she understands connection, absence, and emotional consistency moving forward. That influence may be subtle, but it's real. This is why the impact of disappearing often outlives the silence itself. Not because it caused pain, but because it triggered awareness. And once awareness settles in, the experience becomes part of how someone grows, not something they remain stuck inside. Conclusion. Disappearing doesn't just end a connection, it reshapes it. From confusion to emotional recalibration, each stage reveals how absence affects perception, reflection, and growth. For someone in a relationship, your silence becomes more than a lack of communication. It becomes a mirror, highlighting patterns, needs, and boundaries they may not have noticed before. Understanding this process isn't about blame or manipulation. It's about insight. Absence has weight, and it leaves an imprint. Whether intentionally or not, what you leave behind changes how she sees herself, the relationship, and ultimately how she navigates future connections with awareness and emotional clarity. B.